Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your first flip after y'all started your Renaissance art presentations, right? Really, really love it. I think Medusa and Mackenzie did a great job today. Really, really set a good bar because remember, you're not going to be tested on these artworks. You're really not. You might be asked to understand illusions in them and actually understand different ideas about them, but we're mainly taking our time to appreciate European history in an intrinsic way when we look at these visual representations of art and how they mirror the elements of humanism, right? But now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's going on in the background behind it. Who's paying for them? What's going on? Is there a political situation on the rise that's going down in Europe as well? And we're not going to try to crush you with a really, really long flip. But this will be your last flip before your test, right? So you will not have to worry about doing anything over the weekend except getting ready for that test, studying, doing your study cover, and doing all that stuff, right? So the big thing about it, though, is let's dive headfirst into Renaissance art, right? We talked a little bit in class about Gothic architecture and stuff like that and Renaissance architecture, but now we're going to kind of be more along the lines focusing on the difference between visual arts as well as representational art going forward. So the big thing you always have to start off by talking about is patronage, right? I love the fact that I think it was Savannah and I think Maisie in class were talking a lot about, oh, the patron of my artwork, whatever. I love that they already know what a patron is, right? But patronage is so important when it comes to talking about Renaissance artwork, right? You got to know and understand that the Renaissance artwork is not only a reflection of the humanistic values of the Renaissance, but it's also a reflection of the growing economy of the Renaissance era Europe, right? Because there's more money in circulation now. There's more people making a lot of money. There's more wealth, like the Medici families and stuff like that. And also groups like the guilds of Europe are making enough money to support these artists and pay for these works, right? And Florence is the leader of this whole thing. That's why we call them the Cradle of the Renaissance, right? The Cradle of the Renaissance because they are the leader of artistic patronage. Now, granted, Rome, Venice, Northern Europe, they also patroned a lot of heavy amounts of artworks, but no one patroned artwork quite like Florence. And when we say Rome, we're mainly talking about the papacy, right? When we say Venice, we mainly mean merchant guilds. When we say Northern Europe, we mainly mean wealthy families like the Habsburgs, or later on, when Erla does hers, the Arnulfinis apparently supported one as well. And as you can see, patronage is very important in the entire construction and adornment and going forward and understanding of Renaissance artwork, right? Because looking at this bad boy, Mackenzie was presenting on her dome currently, right? Brunowski's dome. This is the fresco that actually sits inside of that dome, right? That literally layers the walls of the inside of the dome of the Florence Cathedral. The Duomo, aka the Santa Maria del Fiore, is a very beautiful fresco done by a man by the name of George Vasari. Which, interesting little fact, George Vasari also did the history of the lives of the wealthy, or of the best artists of the Renaissance period, and he's the reason why we knew so much stuff about Michelangelo that was going into Ross King's book, right? So the thing about it as well is that this is another big, oh god, yeah, thank you. Okay, so this is a picture of me in front of those gates of paradise and stuff like that in Florence, but again, I don't like how I can't smile for things. And that's also, as you can see as well, I love the fact that you can't see how big they are, though. And so we're going to cover up my face, and we're going to zoom in a little bit, though. So all this stuff, both of these things, were paid for by the Florence Cloth Merchants Guild, right? They paid for them, right? They actually invested in them. The Wool Merchants Guild paid for the gates of paradise and paid for the inner and outer construction of the dome as well. So patronage is very, very important in the making and movement of these different artworks, right? And towards the late 15th century, wealthy individuals are going to begin to patron art as well. It's not just going to be guilds or organizations or things like that. A lot of individuals will begin to pick up the bill. And this quote right here, which is also on your test, just saying, is a primary source written by a very, very specific person from the Renaissance, right? And it says, "I think it casts a brilliance on our estate," which means our public reputation, "and it seems to me that these are monies well spent." And this is a man talking about how much money he has invested in Renaissance artwork. And I'll take 2 seconds to see if you can guess who this guy is. Good job, right? So very, very good job. I think I heard somebody in the background. I think that was Bear over there, Bear got it right. It's Lorenzo De Medici, right? Lorenzo De Medici, Il Magnifico, is going to be the guy that originally said this, right? And you could see this in his regular everyday life as well, due to the fact that he, fostered the growth of the Renaissance. He paid for Ficino to translate the works of Plato. He also, as well, allowed Michelangelo to live in his estate while he was doing his early work. And this right here is one of the earliest works of Michelangelo. It's known as the Battle of the Centaurs, right? Even though, ironically enough, there's no centaurs in it. But it's literally how Michelangelo began his career as a sculptor and things like that, showing a recessive sculpture, much more like Romanesque art that had actually come years and years and years before him, okay? So the thing about it is, Lorenzo De Medici is a very good example of a patron that is not even only paying for artwork, but literally providing stable housing and growth for artists as well, right? The other big thing you got to understand, too, about patrons as well, when we're talking about, and this whole flip is basically about, this part of the flip is basically about patronage of art from wealthy and, upper-class elites, and then we're going to talk about the growth of Renaissance-era monarchies, right? Now, the thing about it is, patrons kind of varied all the time on their influence in artwork in general. For example, you could have some patrons that were super uninvolved, right? You could literally have ones that were just hey, paint me this thing, right? For example, The Birth of Venus by Botticelli was patroned by the Medici family. We believe by Lorenzo Medici. And he did not actually actively say, I want it to look like this, this, this. He let him paint on his own. But then there are patrons like Julius II, as we know from reading Ross King's book, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, that he was constantly a bother to Michelangelo about timelines and criticisms. And if you remember from the book as well, it was originally supposed to be geometric shapes that had saints' faces in them, and Michelangelo didn't like that and went away from that as well. And so that's going to be a really big thing, is that patrons and their involvement in the artwork does change from time to time, depending on the artwork and depending what they're going for, right? So looking at this, for example, Julius II bothered the daylights out of him about the Sistine Chapel ceiling, whereas the Medici family would just kind of allow the artists to do all of their work, right? Now, the other big thing, though, too, is I really love to talk about how this is just a direct mirrored representation of growths of economies and growths of trends during all of European history. Because you have to understand, for the rest of your existence, something is very important. Transition in Europe moves in waves, right? It's kind of like dropping a rock into a still little pool of water and watching the ripples move out, right? And so the big thing is that this rock was dropped in Italy, and then everything moved out of Italy, right? Now, this is the one time that Italy is going to be super important early on. Italy doesn't really make a lot of really big, large historical impacts again until we get to Italian unification and stuff like that. But rich people spent their money in the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, in one way, and the Renaissance is going to be that new rock that sends the progression of this out to the rest of Europe, right? So the Middle Ages period, this is how people spent their money. And during the medieval era, buying a suit of armor was considered how you actually demonstrated your wealth, right? And the flexibility of the armor and the craftsmanship that went into it was a very important quality that would have. And this is right here is wearing a Ferrari, right? That's why actually in medieval era battle, it was very uncommon for anyone to be wearing armor, except for a noble or a lord that might be there, right? So the thing about it as well, though, is during the Renaissance era, money spending is going to change, right? And you're going to see things like this, okay? This right here is known as the Cellini salt cellar, right? That, I'm not kidding you, is a salt shaker. It's made out of rolled enamel, paint, and as well as gold, right? This salt shaker that has a little spoon for it that you're supposed to scoop the salt out and sprinkle on your table was a household good that was supposed to sit on the table of King Francis I, right? Francis I. And when it actually was made for him and stuff like that, it was very expensive. This salt shaker cost $60 million, right? $60 million for a salt shaker. That's crazy in the modern life. Well, it's insured for $60 million. Now, this right here is another piece by Cellini. That is Perseus holding the head of Medusa, and you can actually see that at the front of my classroom as well. So actually, Cellini was a goldsmith and a sculptor and stuff like that. And so this right here, patroned by who? The Medici family. It's in one of their gardens, right? And also as well, the Renaissance era demonstrates portraiture and real-life understandings of people as well. The Mona Lisa was actually paid for by a guy by the name of Ghiberto. I think it's Ghirlandaio is the guy that actually paid for it, and this is his wife, and he was a wealthy wool merchant, right? So the big thing about it in general, though, is wealthy people were beginning to use their money and influence to buy art, right? And the artists had gotten so much better because of the growth of humanism. Now, in general, though, that right there is Renaissance culture in and of a nutshell, right? And so getting into it as well is you could also see the progression progression of art during this time period by just looking at Middle Ages art. Right here is the Bayou Tapestry. It literally is a tapestry that demonstrates the Norman invasion of England from the Middle Ages and stuff like that. And then you can see this is a pretty crusty piece of artwork, right? And then it would move to like this. Then, over time, this is Renaissance artwork, right? This is the Adoration of the Magi by Botticelli as well. And so, as you can tell, it's getting more realistic and intense, and this is a very humanistic, intensified value of art, right? So, going into it, though, also, we have to talk a little bit about Renaissance culture, particularly focusing on the growth of monarchical power during the Renaissance, right? So, we're going to switch it up a little bit and give yourself a little section break or something like that. But we're now moving into how the Renaissance is also going to affect, or the Renaissance era. The Renaissance doesn't directly make this happen, but you're going to see during the Renaissance the growth of these new monarchies that are going to be more consolidated, and they're going to be able to actually extend rule over more of an area of their country, right? So during the Renaissance period, you need to understand that classes and societies began to grow, right? Classes are beginning to grow, and they're beginning to separate a little bit as well, right? So jot that down real quick. The wealthy are becoming more wealthy, and the poor are becoming more poor, right? Because as the economics are being reinvigorated back into Europe as well, merchant guilds were only owned by an elite few, right? Like, so craftsman guilds were only worked in by an elite few. The bulk of Europe still worked on farms and things like that. And here's another big thing, too. The Renaissance didn't really affect poor people. It's important to point this out, that the Renaissance was really only experienced by the super wealthy, right? By the very, very wealthy, and it's going to be imbibed by nobles, the church, and the monarchs as well, right? But the thing about nobles, speaking of, is they're beginning to shrink in size and in power. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they are not fast enough adapting to the growth of new economics, right? Guilds are beginning to make more money than they are. Crafts guilds are beginning to make more money than they are. Merchants are making more money than they are. The big thing about it is that nobility and their understanding of their influence is beginning to shrink a little bit. There is a very tiny middle class that operates in those guilds. It's beginning to grow, but it's borderline insignificant. It's that small. And then the ruling class is looking to desire more power. And by what we mean by the ruling class is the monarchies, right? The monarchies are going to make a very large bet on themselves during the Renaissance period that could have gone really, really wrong, but went really, really well for a lot of them, right? A lot of these banking families, for example, like the Fugers in Germany are going to loan money to the Habsburgs, and the Medici in Italy are going to loan money to multiple other monarchs like the Valois of France and things like that. And as these banking families began to issue loans to monarchs, the monarchs are going to take that money to try and help grow their power, right? And they're going to try and invest in ruling authority. And so you're going to see the rise of these really intense new monarchies as political power begins to shift during the Renaissance era, right? Because during the Middle Ages, there was just all of these wars that damaged the ability for the monarchs to ever actually be able to lead, right? Riddled with wars between nobles and rulers and the weakening power of rulers. And a lot of this is because monarchs of the Middle Ages were believed to be on the same standing as the nobility, right? The nobles believed that they were just as powerful as monarchs were. And so every single time there would be these things known as a secession crisis, nobles would fight one another or fight other monarchical families to try and make it so their children became the new kings and queens of Europe, right? Good example of these two wars are like both of these happened in Britain. The 100 Years' War was between France and Great Britain. It was over secession because literally one family died out and they needed another family to come in and replace them, right? And so that was a really, really big one as well. And so going into it as well as looking at the War of the Roses, same thing. The House of York and the House of Lancaster are going to fight against each other to try and take control of the British throne. And at the Battle of crud, I got to go look it up, and me and Mr. Waters don't talk about it. He knows what it is. But like the father of Henry VIII, Henry VII, is going to win this massive war and stuff like that, and put the Tudors in charge of like all of like the United Kingdom. And so you're seeing the rise of new monarchies during the Renaissance period, though, because they're looking to deliberately grow their power. And there's two ways for monarchs to do this. After they borrow all that money from those banking families, they have to, one, weaken the power of nobles, and they have to weaken the reach of the church, right? And what I mean by that is that's why monarchs were getting into feuds with the Pope for the investiture crisis, right? They wanted to figure out ways to check the power of the Pope, to keep him in Rome, and allow them to rule over their countries in a more effective and deliberate way. Now, this is going to become a very important concept, not in the next unit, but the one right after it, right? When we get into the era of absolutism, which is one of my favorite things to teach about, right? But going into it a little bit as well, there are obstacles for the royals, right? These new ruling families like the Valois, the Tudors, the Habsburgs, all these other figures that are becoming in charge, the Castiles of Spain, they have some things in their way that are standing in the way of their power. And a lot of it includes communication. It's very difficult for them to communicate with people because they don't have postal services or ways to actually get the word out very effectively or even to effectively tax people to gain enough money. And they also have really small militaries, right? Mostly due to the fact that whenever monarchs wanted to go to war during the Middle Ages, they had to tell the nobles to bring people to form an army. And if a noble didn't like you, they could just say, no, I don't want to do that. Right? So they had a lot of power still vested in the nobility and things like that. So these obstacles are massively standing in the way for them to grow their power substantially. But yeah, so there were huge amounts of obstacles for these monarchs to even grow their power because they couldn't even communicate or have a very large military, right? So the big thing that you have to understand is there is one fantastic example of monarchies growing their power. And it's one of the earliest examples of this entire growth of power. And it's in this thing known as the Spanish Inquisition, right? The easiest example to try and demonstrate early on, because we will bring this entire theme up repeatedly. For the next several hundred years in European history, all the way from the 1500s to the 1800s, monarchs are trying to get more powerful, and they want to become the ruling body, a thing that is unquestionable authority and kind of exists like the Pope does in Rome, right? They want to be this single-guided thing, and they hate that nobles are standing in their way, and they hate that the church is standing in their way, right? They want to weaken the power of the nobility, they want to weaken the reach of the church, and they are going to figure out the issues, the communication and smart military thing, will be figured out more in the 1500s, 1600s, but there is a really good example of Renaissance-era monarchs growing their power first, right? And the biggest example is the period known as the Spanish Inquisition, because no one saw it coming.
There's trouble at the mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Yet none of y'all get that joke. Your parents might if they've seen Monty Python, right? But the big thing about it in general is that you have to understand that the Spanish Inquisition, first and foremost, before we go any further, is not it's weird, okay? Let me explain this really, really quickly. When anyone says the Spanish Inquisition, what they're referring to is Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain's growth in power, right? They're growing their influence and power, and they're becoming the monarchical house, the Castiles of Spain, right? The Spanish Inquisition is both referred to as a period of time, because it's the Spanish Inquisition period. It's also referred to as an organization, because it's an institution. It's a thing. It's a group of people, right? So but let's go ahead and dive into it real quick. But know when I'm talking about the Spanish Inquisition, I'm both referring to an organization and also an entire area of time. But don't let that confuse you too much. If you need help, come on in, and we'll lay it out with a graphic organizer or something, all right? But it all hinges around the struggle of power in Spain, right? Now, this whole thing started with the marriage of two very important people. Ferdinand Castile, who was the king of Spain, and Isabella, who was the daughter of a wealthy noble family from Spain as well, right? And so what we're going to see happen in this marriage and in this union, we're going to see the deliberate attempt at the growth of power in an interesting little country that had a lot of crazy little things going on and kind of a really different culture because a different group of religions lived there and stuff like that. But getting into it, so you understand, by the time in the 1400s when Spain and Ferdinand come along, or not Spain and Ferdinand, Isabella and Ferdinand come along, Spain was not a consolidated country the way you view it now, right? They actually were a loose confederation of states, right? And this loose confederation of states was ruled over by wealthy noble families. And so what was really making Isabella and Ferdinand really frustrated was the fact that they wanted to rule over the entirety of Spain, not just the Castile region in the north that they were ruling over, right? And so what's going down is Isabella and Ferdinand, mostly Isabella, because in the honest thing, she's the really intense ruler out of the two of them. Old girl did not play, right? But Isabella and Ferdinand decide that they want to make deliberate attempts to grow their authority. And a big thing they got to do is they have to figure out a way to consolidate these states together. Now, to do that, you have to figure out a way, first and foremost, to weaken the power of the nobles that run those individual states, right? And so what they're going to do is they are going to bar higher nobles from coming into some of their security councils, right? Councils were these really big things, kind of like court parties, right? Where these people would show up and become courtiers and advise the king and the queen, right? And their power was vested inside of the monarchs as well. How they're going to do this, though, is they're going to bar higher nobles, which is a small group of people from these councils, and invest instead in installing lower nobles. Lower or lesser nobles were nobles that weren't as wealthy as the higher nobles. But by bringing in the lesser nobles into their councils, the higher nobles would be kind of clipped out. And just because they had money and influence doesn't mean that they can't now access the money and influence of the larger body of lesser nobles beneath them. And this is going to help them go to war. It's going to help it make so they can consolidate the military together in a very, very efficient way. And it's going to help them grow their power in a big way. So just know it's like higher noble, lesser noble, yes, right? So like trying to install more prestige within those families. They're also going to begin to take out loans, both from some of these lesser nobles and from some of the banking families that are popping up as well, to decrease their dependence on taxes that were collected by the noble families. Because you have to understand, with that communication thing, if you can't send mail effectively, you're probably not collecting taxes effectively in the 1400s. Because what monarchs did during the 1400s is they gave nobles the job to go out and collect taxes for them. And the taxes would then be divvied up and spent by the monarchs, right? This was a very weird system that would kind of operated in a little goofy way, but what they needed to do was take out a larger loan so they didn't depend on these higher nobles who were taking in the taxes, right? So what ends up going down after that is they also want to plead with the church. They got to figure out a way, because Spain is devoutly Catholic, right? How are you going to get the Pope on your side, right? Because the big thing they want to do is they want to appoint their own bishops, right? That's that investiture crisis and stuff like that. Isabella and Ferdinand are the first two that are going to realize, I'm going to have to do a favor for the church, and then they'll let me appoint my own bishops. And this is a genius move. Don't go to war with the Pope, because the Pope can call down every other leader of Europe on top of you, right? So Isabella and Ferdinand get to actually appoint their own bishops, which is a really big deal. But they do it, or they get to do it, because they involved the church in this religious purity thing they're going off on, and it's real strange. So what they're going to do is the goal of the Spanish Inquisition is to pick up where the monarchs before Isabella and Ferdinand had left off, right? So you have to understand the Spanish Inquisition, in its authority and backed up by Isabella and Ferdinand, are trying to purify the country of something that they don't like, right? Now, looking at this map really quick, it's all a result of this thing known as the Reconquista, right? And the Reconquista has been going on since 790, all the way up until when Isabella and Ferdinand come into power. And what the Reconquista was when literally Spain was trying to reconquest the entirety of Spain and give it back to European Spaniards, right? So everything right here in green used to belong to Muslims of the Umayyad Caliphate, right? The Muslims controlled that entire area in the south area of Spain. It's why there's that architecture in the south of Spain that we looked at in one of the summer flips that demonstrates the growth of their influence. But as you can see, this green area is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the years go on, because the ancestors of Isabella and Ferdinand, their great-great-great-grandmothers and grandfathers and stuff like that, were pushing the Spanish out using a very much larger military to try and purify the area and get rid of Muslim influence, right? And so when Isabella and Ferdinand come into power, they decide to do a favor for the church, so they get to appoint their own bishops. And what they do is they decide to turn their sights on the leftover Jewish population and Muslim population that were in Spain during the Reconquista, right? Because as this green territory got smaller and smaller and smaller, it doesn't mean that the Jewish people and all the Muslims left as like control passed to the Europeans, right? A lot of them are going to stay. And so Isabella and Ferdinand unleash the Spanish Inquisition with one goal: to try and push the Muslims out of southern Spain and to try and convert the Jewish people of Spain as well, right? And so what's going to end up going down is the Spanish monarchy and church are going to team up together in this sense to try and go against them, right? And sermons at fiery Catholic masses are going to lash out against the Muslims and Jewish populations of Spain and say that they are there to destroy the economies of all these different people, which is racist and super screwed up. And what's going to happen is so many Jewish people and Muslim people are going to fear for their life they're going to mostly run away. 40% of the Jewish population of Spain left Spain, or they had to do another thing. You could either leave or convert, right? Leave or convert or be killed, right? So with that, some Jews did stay. About 60% of the Jewish people stayed and converted to Catholicism, right? And they were known as conversos, right? Conversos, or the converted, right? And so with that, then the Spanish Inquisition was started, right? Because there was a huge amount of resentment towards these conversos people, right? The conversos, they believed, still had some power. Then came the Spanish Inquisition. So this is the body, okay? The Spanish Inquisition was a group of people, priests and like inquisitors, that were in charge with finding and hunting down these conversos who didn't really convert. Because there was this massive amount of rumor going around that, oh, those conversos over there who still have a lot of money and stuff like that and are controlling a lot of the economics in Spain, they never really converted. They're just pretending. So we got to have a body that's going to root them all out, right? And so Isabella and Ferdinand are going to use the Spanish Inquisition to continue to rile up the population of Spain, to continue to grow their power and appear as the saviors of Catholicism, which again is super screwed up and very racist, right? They came, then like the Spanish Inquisition comes in to try and find these conversos and tries to be like, hey, the former Jewish population, are you eating pork? Because I know in your old faith you weren't allowed to do that. If you're really Catholic, you'll do it. If you're really Catholic, you'll do this. And they've literally worked to try and find and root out as many of these false Christians as possible. At that point, 200,000 Jewish people lived in Spain, and that converted and became conversos. And literally 150,000 of them will leave and flee because of the Spanish Inquisition. And we believe that the Spanish Inquisition put on trial conversos and had over 3,000 to 5,000 of them executed, right? Oh my, executed by burning at the stake and torture and all these other methods to try and just grow the power of Isabella and Ferdinand, right? And the other crazy thing is Isabella and Ferdinand are going to have a daughter, all right, named Joanna the Mad, who's going to get married to Philip the Handsome, who is the son of Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, and their child would be Charles V, a very important absolutist that we'll talk about a little bit later, okay? The big thing about it is other new monarchs are going to begin to consolidate power just like Isabella and Ferdinand did, right? Using this new military structure, using this manipulation of the nobles, using this manipulation of the church to try and grow their authority, right? One of the most famous examples is the Tudors in England. Henry VIII broke his church away to try and reduce the power of the church in England. The Valois in France are going to try to do this as well when they try to appeal to the Catholic faith and they try to root the Protestants out during their wars of religion, right? Now, the HRE, though, and the East are a little bit different, right? The Holy Roman Empire had very little success in creating huge, strong monarchies, mostly due to the fact that they were just so fragmented, right? Like, if you look at this map, there were so many different districts and states that all spoke different languages and stuff like that, that it was a really, really difficult time for any huge monarch to come to massive power there, right? And we'll get to a lot of that stuff when we get into absolutism as well as the Reformation. But lunch is about to start. I got to convert this flip so I can get it up there for y'all, all right? Y'all have a great time, though. This is the last bit of stuff that's on your test. Y'all have a good one, all right?